Yeah, we're thinking a little bit about dads this morning in terms of one of the startling statements that Jesus made. If you were with us last week, you know we kind of began a summer series where we're taking a look at some of the hard sayings or the startling statements that Jesus makes that when you read them, you just leave scratching your head or say what? What are you talking about, Jesus? And sometimes we just kind of read right over them because they're so hard to figure out. And the truth is, if we will stop and take time to really look at them, there are some things that are there that we may not hear from him in any other place. So we're going to be taking some looks at some of those. Last week, we took a look at the first one. Today, we're going to take a look at still another one that speaks about fathers and mothers. So this is from the book of Luke, chapter 14. I'm going to read just really 3 verses, beginning with verse 25. These words. So now large crowds were going along with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yet even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Well, I don't know what it was like for you and your house in terms of taboo words when your kids are growing up, but for us, we had a few taboo words that were off limits in the house. Some of them are pretty obvious, but one of them that I really didn't like to hear at all was the H word, the word hate. Use the word hate, and you pretty much got an automatic timeout for a bit in the corner. There's no real need to use a word like hate. And yet, here we have Jesus using just that word. Now, I think most of us would agree, if you follow Christ, or even if you're just exploring him, that no matter what you think about him, he was certainly a great teacher. And when you read these statements, you've got to ask the question, what is he saying when he uses the H word here, the hate word? And so we're going to look at this statement where he says, you must hate your father and your mother. Now, the reaction of some of us is to say, well, that's crazy, Jesus. I mean, what a terrible thing to say. Others of us probably secretly might be saying, well, that's not really necessary to tell me. I already hate them already because of how they've treated me. But whether that's true secretly or not so secretly, that you feel hurt or disappointment at your dad or your mom, most certainly if you do, there's a deep wound in your life because of it. And Jesus has an answer for that deep wound. He says, if you hate your father and mother my way, you will find healing from the hate you experience for your parents your own way. So we're going to take a look at this startling statement. And the first thing you learn really right from the get-go pretty much is that the larger statement shows that this really isn't about moms and dads. This statement really is about discipleship. And Jesus is going to tell us a number of things about what it means to be a follower of him, a disciple of him. In fact, I'm going to suggest we can pull 5 different characteristics of discipleship from these words of Jesus here in this section. And the first thing we learned from Jesus about discipleship and following him is that discipleship is non-optional. Again, look at the very first part of verse 25. He says, now great crowds were going along with him and he turned and said to them. Now, when it says he turned to the larger crowd and said to them, the question I have is, who is he turning away from? He's turning to the crowds. Who is he turning away from? Well, the answer is he's turning away from the 12 disciples who are right behind him or around him. And so he's talking to the larger crowd. Now, what we have to understand is that if you read the larger context of this section of Luke, you'll realize that Jesus is on a road trip with his inner circle, his 12 disciples, and he has first talked to those 12. In chapter 12, in fact, first he has words for that inner circle, those 12 followers he calls the disciples. And we read those words in chapter 12, verse 1. Listen. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples. He's saying, be on guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So earlier he has talked to the 12. But those were the insiders. These are the ones that have signed up for kind of full-time ministry, and they're the ones that are kind of all in, those 12, and maybe a few others along the way. But now in this chapter, in chapter 14, he's going to speak not to the inner circle. Now he's talking to the larger crowd. Now he's talking to everyone who's ready and willing to listen to him. And what that means is that Jesus does not have two different standards. Some people think that, when it comes to being a Christian, you really got two levels. You got to decide which one you're going to pick. There's the kind of regular level of being a follower of Christ where, you come to church and you don't get too excited about it, but you do a few things along the way to kind of help out. And then there are the others, so the devoted ones, the fully in ones, the fully devoted. They're ready to go to the mat for Christ no matter what. But Jesus really doesn't distinguish and say there's two different standards, the regular one and then the kind of super one. He says really there's one standard. The one standard is if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to be willing to carry your cross and come after me. And verse 27 says that whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So if you want to follow me at all, Jesus says, you have to put me first. I have to be ahead of all the other things that are important to you. If you want to be a follower of mine, I come ahead of your mom and dad. I come ahead of your career, all the other dreams. I will, he says, accept one position in your life, and that position is first. Sacrificial discipleship is the only position he's willing to take. There's not a double standard. Full discipleship is the only option. He wants you to love him with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to put him first, to love him most. And so to be a Christian is to be a disciple. One of the things that drives me crazy is and they come all the time in the mail, these kind of postcards with these introductory rates for, say, high-speed internet access. So it says in big, bold letters, $29.95 for, 10 MIPS of broadband. And so you think, oh, that's a pretty good price, I guess. So you sign up for it. The bills come for the first 12 months. And then on month 13, you happen to look at your bill again, and it's doubled or tripled because now the introductory rate has expired, and now you're paying the regular full rate. That was the fine print you didn't read when you first got the mailer, by the way. Jesus does not say to the larger crowd he's talking to that day, Come to me, all you who are weak and heavy laden. I will give you rest. I will give you life and give it abundantly. And then turn around to the inner circle, the 12, and say, oh, by the way, what you need to know is there are going to be crosses to bear too. Yeah, crosses. We're going to keep that from those guys until later on. But no, he doesn't do that. He tells everybody right up front what it means to be a follower of his. I'm not going to hide the cost, he says. There's one standard. If you want to be a follower of mine, this is the standard. There are going to be times when you got to be willing to carry your cross. You got to be willing to put me first. Be full-throated in your following of me. And so that's the first blank. If you're filling them in, there's 5 blanks in the back there. Here's the first one. Discipleship is non-optional. Everybody is called to the same standard. Second thing we learn, not only is discipleship non-optional, discipleship is also unpredictable. He says, look, anyone who comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sister, even his own life, cannot be my disciple. Now, when you take a look at that list of family members, one of the things you notice about it is it really kind of reflects the various stages of our lives in terms of who matters the most at different times of our lives. When you're a child, the people that matter most to you are your mom and your dad, your father and mother. When you grow up, you get married as such, then it's your wife and your children that matter the most, that are the front and center of your life. And then later on, almost certainly as your own parents get older and your own kids are grown, and all of a sudden you realize your own parents need to be cared for. At least this has been my case. You get more closely attached again to your sisters and brothers as you try to figure out how to care for those aging parents along the way. But the whole idea is your life revolves around your family. And especially in Jesus' day, it was all about your family and your extended family. Different than us here in America, where there's a lot more individualism about, living on your own, separate from your family. Not back in Jesus' day. You never did anything that would even remotely shame your family or disgrace your family. You'd never, ever dream of moving away from your family. You'd never marry someone outside your family's blessing. Jesus is saying, look, I know that's the normal agenda that people have in their life. But if you want to follow me, it's not going to be necessarily normal for you. If you are wanting to follow me, you have to be willing to kiss that agenda of yours goodbye. I didn't say you have to, that you will end up losing that hope and dream of that family like that. But you have to be willing to give up your agenda to follow me. He says, don't come to me with your own agenda and demand that I fit into your life. Don't come to me saying, here's how I want my life to go. Come on, Jesus, get this to work for me, will you? Even on this Father's Day, let me say, don't come to Jesus and say, Lord, help me to be a better father or mother or brother or sister as the primary focus. Now, you follow Jesus, you will be a better father, mother, sister, and brother. But when you make that the focus, you're missing the point. Jesus doesn't want to be the means and will not be the means to your end. Jesus will be the end or nothing at all. He is the end and the beginning, the first and the last and the middle. Don't come to me, he says, with your expectations of how your life is supposed to go. Don't come to me expecting that what I'm going to do is let you fulfill all the predictable roles that you've already got in your mind that you want life to look like. If you want to follow me, Plan on times coming when life gets unpredictable, and I ask you to do things that weren't on your dance card. You weren't expecting along the way. Some of you have read the book, Chronicles of Narnia, and in the story, there's a point where the young daughter, Lucy, hears about Aslan, the lion, the Christ figure. And she says, "Oh, a lion. Is he safe?" "Safe," one of the kids says. "Who said anything about being safe? Of course he's not safe. He's a lion, for heaven's sake." But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And that's what Jesus is saying here. You're going to follow me. I'm not safe, but I'm good. If you want your life to be outlined according to all your preconceived ideas, don't expect me to come and just kind of support all that. If you want to follow me, I come first. I want to be at the center of your life. Don't make me the means with your life as the end. I am the end and the beginning. If you want to follow me, you must say, "I will be with you wherever you ask me to be." So let me just ask a question about your life. You find yourself today with a life that's pretty placid and predictable, pretty much one day looks like the next day, no big challenges, no big surprises, same old, same old. That's not the life that Jesus probably is envisioning here. Jesus says, with me, you can throw away the script of what you thought your life was going to look like. Throw that away with fear and trembling, but gladly, and follow Jesus on the adventure of a lifetime you could never imagine. And so discipleship is not only non-optional. Here's the second blank. Discipleship is unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to ask you to do next. But if you're going to follow him, you're going to be willing to listen and go his way. And then we go to the third kind of thought on the characteristics of being a follower of Christ. And this is where we run into that offensive word that makes this such a startling statement, that word hate. If anyone, verse 26, comes to me and does not hate. Now, why would Jesus use such a word? I mean, most of us kind of just intuitively get that he can't be really saying, I want you, I demand that you be openly hostile to your mom and dad. I mean, we know from all the other things he said, he's not going to tolerate that. He says to love your enemies. He says you're not even allowed to hate the wicked. So how in the world can he be talking about hating your father and your mother? Well, he's not using the word hate in the normal sense of being actively hostile. See, in the Bible, there's really two ways you can use the word hate. You can use it to mean to hate something actively, like we often use the word, generally use the word. But you can also, and it's also used in Scripture, to speak about hating comparatively. And the best example of that is in Genesis chapter 29. You probably know the story of Jacob. He has two wives, Leah and Rachel, and twice in verses 31 and 33, we're told that Jacob loved Rachel but hated Leah. Now, our modern translations tone it down a little bit. The NIV, the Bible that we use here, says this, verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. That verb, Leah was not loved. That's a euphemism for the literal word hate. In fact, if you read an older translation, it's more literal. You'll see it says that Leah was hated. Now, what does that mean? Did Jacob really hate his other wife? Well, absolutely not. In fact, we're told explicitly not. in verse 30, where we read, his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. So his love for Rachel was so much incredibly larger that compared to his love for Rachel, his love for Leah was almost like hate, if you will, comparatively. And what Jesus is saying is this. Look, there's all kinds of different love you need to have, and you do have, for those people that you are part of. Your love for your mom and dad is different than your love for your wife and your kids. It's different than your love for your sister and your brother. But all those loves put together pale in comparison to the kind of love I want you to have for me. I want you to love me like Rachel. I want to be the Rachel of your life. Now, we could say, well, okay, so he's saying he wants to be first in our life. He does want to be first in our life. But that's not what he's saying here. He's not just saying, I want to be the first priority and commitment you have in your life. I want to be the first love of your life. I want you to experience a deep emotional connection with me and to know me in that kind of loving sort of a way. Not just as kind of a cognitive commitment of your will, but the commitment of your heart to me. I want your love. You leave today and go outside and look up in the sky, and you'll see the sun and some clouds, blue sky. But what you won't see right now, this time of day, are all those stars that you see at night. You know, those stars, you know this, are still there. They're still there. It's just you can't see them in the daylight because of the overwhelming brilliance of the sun. That all those stars are just washed out because of the brilliance of the star. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He says, I'm not saying to not love the people in your life. Love them deeply. It's just that you need to love me more. That's what I want. Judy and I have been kind of watching a series on Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, who wrote the great book, probably, I think, the greatest, most impactful book of Western civilization, City of God. And in that book, he talks about how it is that the key to a transformed life is the right ordering of our loves. If we get the loves of our life ordered rightly, that's what will change our life. And so having God be the one we love the most. And when that's there all the time, it puts the right balance on all the other loves of our life. So let's see if we can flesh that out a little bit. Today's Father's Day. I don't know if you heard any nervous laughter when we talked about hating our fathers and mothers, but the truth is I've talked to enough people along the way to know that for some of you there's a lot of ambivalence about your feelings about your dad or your mom. Disappointment about how they've overlooked you or not loved you or you could never meet their expectations or whatever. And I've just seen over and over again that when people have that deep, abiding disappointment or even hurt with the relationship they had with their dad, it's kind of like a cloud that follows them everywhere. Now, you may not even be ready to admit that, or the shame of that, or the fear that you could never meet his expectations, that you were always a disappointment to him. But you know what Paul would say, what Augustine would say as well? The problem, or the solution, is not for you to somehow blow off what you wanted from your dad. The solution to not getting the love you wanted from your dad is not to hate your dad, saying, well, I didn't want that love anyway. Or it's not to say, well, you never did do what I wanted you to do, so forget you. See, the key isn't to try to want that love less. The key is to love God more. If you love God more, that helps you with the balance of realizing that human love is always limited, and some people will never give you the kind of love you would like to have received from them. But what Paul is saying, or what Jesus is saying here, is that if you're willing to love me most, then you'll be able to deal with the disappointments of not having the kind of human love you always hoped for along the way. And so what Jesus is really saying here, he says, I want you to love me. Love me deeply. Love me emotionally. Now, I know that sounds, really, from a Presbyterian type like you to say that kind of thing? Yeah. God wants your love. He wants your love, not just your head. He wants your heart. And so that's the third blank, if you're filling them in. Discipleship is supposed to be deeply emotional. He says, I want you to put me first, yes, but I want you to love me. But then the question is, so how do you do that? What does that really look like? How do you deepen that kind of love for the Father? Well, Jesus says what we need to do is take up our cross. That's what he says. Now, I'm struck by how Jesus speaks about what it takes to be a follower of his. He does not say, to be a follower of mine means to take up my teachings and follow me, or to take up my example and follow me. I mean, if you've ever tried that, and some of you have, to try to take his teachings and really carry them, you've probably gotten a half a dozen steps and been crushed by it all. I mean, you take the Sermon on the Mount and you just try for a few days to never envy, always forgive, always be poor in spirit, always turn the other cheek, all the other things that Jesus talks about there, and you will find yourself crushed. You can't do that. At least you can't do it for long. To be a follower of Christ is not to try to do everything you can to fulfill all the teachings that Jesus speaks about. Jesus says to be a follower of mine is to take up your cross and follow me. Well, what does that mean? Henry Sweet says to take up your cross can mean only one thing. It means to put yourself in the place of a condemned criminal. Well, that sounds pretty depressing until you remember which condemned man we're talking about. Which condemned man we are to identify ourselves with. And Jesus is saying the essence of discipleship is realizing that when I died, you died. Identify with me. And when I came back to life, you came back to life. In fact, that's what Paul says in the book of Colossians. Listen, since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your heart on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things, for you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. The Bible says that the minute you believe in Jesus, you died on that cross with him and were buried with him. What does it mean? It means that when God looks at you, he looks at what Christ has already done for you. And that's why in another passage where Jesus uses the same imagery, in Luke's chapter 9, he says, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. What does it mean to take up your cross daily? Well, it means when you wake up each morning, the first thing you think about isn't, all the things you got to do today and getting through that checklist of things that are on that have to be accomplished. The first thing you remember is who you are in Christ. And that because you have been now united with him, you have died and you no longer have to prove anything to be loved and valued and accepted. Because now you live in the shadow of the cross. When you live in the shadow of the cross, it means on the one hand that you live a life of sacrificial service, as did Jesus. But it also means that you do and live that life of sacrificial service out of the fullness of what God and Christ has already done for you. You have this immense emotional wealth because all that Jesus has done for you, this whole new identity, this whole new forgiveness, and this whole new redemption is now there with you. And you can live out of the wealth of that. And so discipleship is emotional because it's positional. We are constantly called back to remember who we now are in Christ. Let me just push it a little bit more. When you get to verse 26, he says not only to hate your father and mother and the rest of the family, you also are called to hate your very life. Now, again, what's Jesus saying here? Is he saying you got to kind of somehow participate in self-loathing and self-hatred? No. Self-loathing and self-hatred are just other forms of self-obsession. It's still all about you. What Jesus is inviting us to do is to take the spotlight away from us and to have it on him. To realize that when you've been crucified with him, you become someone that's not thinking about yourself. You're self-forgetful. You're not self-loathing or self-flagellating, or you become self-forgetful. And because you've got this new standing because of Christ, you don't have to prove things to anyone. You don't need to constantly have the spotlight on yourself. You won't be so thin-skinned when criticism comes. You won't be so easily hurt when you're overlooked. Because it's not about you, and your value isn't what you do, it's what has been done for you. So discipleship, and here's the fourth blank, is essentially positional. It's positional. The problem with reading the Bible, if you've read it a few times, maybe many of us, many years of our life, is that we just get so acquainted with the imagery that it doesn't have the I guess I'll just say shock value that it had when Jesus first said these words. And no point or no image is more clear than when Jesus starts talking about the cross. The cross, was a symbol of execution. And this is the essential image of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. The essential image of being a follower of Jesus is a symbol of execution. I mean, imagine a candidate today, and he is beginning his campaign and says, "Hey, everybody, come with me, join me, strap yourself into an electric chair, let's go." Or, "Put on a blindfold, smoke your last cigarette, and listen for the crack of the rifles." But that's what Jesus is saying. You got to be willing to die if you're going to follow me. Now, that's overwhelming when you think about it. But in another way, it's important to remember that when he calls us to take up our cross, he's not asking us to do it all at once. That is the surrendering all at once. He doesn't say, interestingly, he could have. He doesn't say, put your head on this block and wait for the sword to fall and you have instant death. He's not asking that. See, the thing about crucifixions is that they happen gradually. You slowly see the life being taken from you. And when it comes to following Jesus, it's the same way. You give Jesus what you know of him today. You'll know more about who you are tomorrow, and you'll give more of him tomorrow. And the whole idea of discipleship is the more I learn about myself, the more I give to him. And the more I learn about myself and the more I learn about him, the more I'm willing to give to him. It's a kind of an ongoing, gradual surrender of your life to him. Boy, isn't this a fun sermon on Father's Day when you thought, we're going to talk about, screwdrivers or something else. I don't know. Sometimes we come to faith and, there are just so many blessings and so many gifts we receive from God himself. But it's also so important to remember there's a cost to following Jesus. And when we're willing to pay the price, we find the benefits. You don't get the benefits from just having this shallow sort of understanding of Christ. You get the benefits when you're willing to let him be the Lord of all. And that's what he's talking about in this passage today. And so let's learn what it means each day to whoever and whatever we know of ourselves to keep giving that over and over to him. And when we do that, we'll find the joy he speaks about. We'll find more love for the people in our lives. And when we do that, we'll become his people and all that he wants us to be.